Very happy to be here. I'm actually surprised to be here. It kind of came out of left field when Sally asked me if I would come and speak, and I said I would be honored and delighted. For those of you who don't know me, I am a blogger. That's my blog address there, and as Sally mentioned, I'm the author of this book, Fathead Kids, Stuff About Diet and Health I Wish I Knew When I Was Your Age, which contains more than 200 cartoons drawn by a very talented artist who happens to be my wife. And then because that didn't seem like enough work, we decided we would take this book and turn it into an animated film, and as Sally said, released in December 4th. We finally have a release date. Thank you. But the project that really got me started on this journey was, of course, my documentary, Fathead. And it's because of Fathead I will always have this kind of warm, fuzzy place in my heart for the Weston A. Price Foundation, because 10 years ago I was a first-time filmmaker. I barely knew what I was doing, and nobody had ever heard of me. And yet, Sally Fallon Morell and Dr. Mary Enig, God rest her soul, were very generous with their time and expertise. In fact, really, it's what I learned from them and some other great sources that kind of changed the direction of the film. It went from being less and less about why this guy's a big fat liar to why these people are big fat liars. And what I learned while making Fathead not only changed the direction of the film, it really changed the direction of my life, because we were living near Hollywood at the time. My wife and I started really thinking about what it means to have a healthy lifestyle. Start asking myself questions like, do I want my kids to become LA kids? Do I want my children addressing me as dude? So we started thinking, it might be better if we at least got them outside the Los Angeles area, maybe 2,000 miles outside the Los Angeles area. So now we live on a little hobby farm in Tennessee, and it's great. I spent my adult life in big cities. I had no idea how much I would enjoy doing farm work on the weekends. Unfortunately, when I do farm work, I have a tendency to do things like get stung by insects that give me a cellulitis infection, knock myself unconscious with a 16-pound T-post hammer, and don't ask how that happened, my memory's still fuzzy. Get beat to hell and flipped in the air by a couple of 300-pound hogs, because they really didn't want to go on a scenic drive to the processing plant. And also continue working on the farm while ignoring the pain in my shoulder that turned out to be a bone spur that severed my bicep tendon. Yes. So other than that, it's a great lifestyle. The only problem is we raise more of our own food now, so I've been eating stuff like sausage and pork chops and fresh eggs and other foods that are going to kill me. In fact, I eat so much of this stuff, by some estimates, I've already been dead for 3 years. And I know these foods will kill me because for years I've been seeing warnings from the experts that look something like this.
Certain foods are high in saturated fat. This is the average amount of saturated fat a person consumes in a month. If you eat too much of this, then over time fatty deposits could build up in your arteries, and this increases your risk of heart disease. If saturated fat can clog this pipe, imagine what it's doing to yours. For ways to cut down, visit the Eat Well website. If you want the facts on food, we're the standard.
So what did we learn from this announcement? Well, for one thing, we learned that saturated fat is a liquid in a cold refrigerator. Then becomes solid in a room temperature drain. But more importantly, we learned that any food that clogs your kitchen sink will clog your coronary arteries. Well, of course, this got me wondering what other foods were lurking in my kitchen, just waiting to clog my coronary arteries. So I hired a couple of lab assistants, and we set out to conduct a series of experiments. Over the course of our research, we discovered that bread will clog your coronary arteries. Apples and bananas will clog your coronary arteries. Brussels sprouts will clog your coronary arteries. Although that probably wouldn't happen if you freaking cook them first. We learned that from the guy we brought in to fix the lab equipment. Eventually, we determined that the only food that does not clog your coronary arteries is chocolate ice cream. Because you can wash that down with some hot liquid and boom, your arteries are clear. Coffee and ice cream for everybody. I want you to live through the weekend. Now, some of you may have noticed my experiment was not based on solid science. Point is, neither is this. So how did this end up replacing what our grandparents, great-grandparents, and hundreds of generations before them understood about what makes for a healthy diet? In other words, what happened? Well, to understand what happened, I'm going to talk about a couple of my favorite books, even though they were not written about diet and health, but they tell us about different ways that human beings make decisions. We'll start with a great book by James Sirowicki. It's called The Wisdom of Crowds. Now, I've had people who never read the book say things to me like, "The wisdom of crowds, are you insane? Every moron in the world has an opinion and they're all on Twitter." Yes, I know, and if I have 2-3 days to kill, I'll even debate one of them. But the wisdom of crowds is not about taking advice from people who don't know what they're talking about. The wisdom of crowds simply means that knowledge is diffuse. It means you can take any subject and millions, if not millions, thousands of people out there know something about it. And if those people have a way of sharing what they know, they often come up with better solutions than the supposed experts. Because little groups of experts almost never have as much combined knowledge as we find out there in the crowd. The wisdom of crowds is based largely on experience. This is the kind of knowledge that we gain by doing things and seeing what the results are. The wisdom of crowds is unplanned. Nobody's in charge of it. Nobody makes the final decision because it's based on spontaneous interactions. And it's through those interactions that the answers and the solutions that actually work bubble up to the top. The wisdom of crowds develops over time. Now, doesn't this sound kind of familiar, especially to people in this group? Of course it does, because for most of human history, this is how we knew which foods were good for us. This was the knowledge of the village. It was the knowledge of the tribe. It was the knowledge that was passed down over the generations. Not that long ago, it was still the kind of knowledge we relied on, even in countries like the United States. And I'll give you an example. This poster was put out by the US government in the 1940s. Meat, eggs, whole milk, and butter were all called protective foods. And look, there's no margarine and no Cheerios. What if you were a diabetic? Well, almost 100 years ago, the cookbook for diabetics told them to eat meat, eggs, fish, butter, cream, and cheese. Told them not to eat sugar, flour, bread, cereals, or pasta. Okay, what if you need to lose some weight? Well, when I was in high school in the mid-1970s, our health teacher was also the wrestling coach. He told us if we wanted to lose weight, we should base our diets on meats, eggs, and vegetables, stop drinking sodas, and stop eating bread, cereal, pasta, and French fries. Now, how did he know this would work? Was he reading studies put out by the Harvard Nutrition Department? No, he knew this from experience, because part of his job was to help high school athletes get down to their competition weight, which he did. Here's another example from the same time period. In 1976, a funny movie came out called Silver Streak. I remember going to see it. Two of the minor characters were fat guys who were trying to lose weight. This was what their diet meal looked like. It's a hamburger patty, full-fat cottage cheese, and tomato slices. It was not a low-fat diet. And those of us of a certain age remember when restaurants used to serve this meal. They called it the waist trimmer. So this is the kind of knowledge we inherited from previous generations. This is what your great-grandparents would have told you a good diet looks like. And what did those previous generations look like? You've been through your grandma's photo albums. They look like this, right? And this, and this. Nobody was talking about an obesity epidemic back then, and rates of diabetes were not going up and up and up like some kind of bad Bitcoin bubble. And yet we abandoned this wisdom of crowds. We decided that the key to living a long and healthy life was to eat foods that only exist because of modern industry. So how did that happen? Well, to explain why it happened, I want to talk about another one of my favorite books. It was written by a professor of economics named Dr. Thomas Sowell. It's called The Vision of the Anointed. What Dr. Sowell describes in the Vision of the Anointed is almost the polar opposite of the wisdom of crowds. Wisdom of crowds assumes that knowledge is diffuse. The anointed assume that knowledge and expertise are concentrated among themselves, of course. The wisdom of crowds is based on experience. The expertise of the anointed is mostly academic and theoretical. The wisdom of crowds is unplanned, but the vision of the anointed is not only planned, it is often imposed. And finally, the wisdom of crowds develops over time, while the anointed tend to fall in love with ideas because they're new or bold or exciting or just exquisitely expressed. So here's how Dr. Sowell, yes, some of you recognize the guy from CSPI. Here's how Dr. Sowell describes the anointed in action. And again, keep in mind, he was not writing about things like nutrition policy. These people operate the same way no matter what the issue is, so it's good to be aware of the pattern. Step one, the anointed identify a problem. This is now the bad. To fix the problem, the anointed will propose a grand plan, preferably something bold and new and exciting. And interestingly, the grand plan often requires spending more of other people's money or restricting more of other people's freedoms, like to buy raw milk, or both. Step three, because they are so supremely confident in their own ideas, the anointed don't think the grand plan should be subjected to little annoyances like proof that it will actually work. Instead, they simply assume that if their intentions are good, then the plan has to be good. And because the bad is so very, very bad, we must act now before it becomes even worse. So the anointed will happily dismiss all evidence that the grand plan is not a good idea or that the theory is wrong. Step four, the anointed assume that no good, intelligent person could possibly oppose the grand plan. Because remember, the grand plan is the good. So people who oppose it aren't just opposing a plan, they are opposing good itself. And they would only do that for one of two reasons. A, they're stupid, or B, they're evil. They are so evil, they want the bad to continue. And so the anointed have no problem trying to silence or even destroy people who do not agree with them. Step five, the anointed will, if they can, impose the grand plan on other people for their own good, of course, because those people are probably stupid and they would not adopt the grand plan on their own. Now, here's where it gets fun. Because of this, it often turns out the grand plan did not bring about the good. In fact, it often turns the bad into the worse. When that happens, the anointed will never, ever, ever admit that the grand plan was a bad idea. As Dr. Sowell says, they are often wrong, but never in doubt. If the grand plan fails, it can only be for one of three reasons. One, the plan was good, but people didn't follow it correctly because they're stupid. Or the plan was good, but it was undermined by people because they're evil. Or three, the plan didn't go far enough. In other words, we need to do the same thing again, only bigger. Now, before we move on, I want to talk about another book that picks up and extends on some of these same themes. It was written by a brilliant author, trader, mathematician, philosopher, a guy named Nassim Nicholas Taleb. It's called Antifragile, and it explains why some systems are fragile, which means they break or completely blow up under pressure, and other systems are antifragile, which means they survive or even get stronger under pressure. The human body's antifragile. If you're exposed to germs and they don't kill you, your immune system gets stronger. If you stress your body through exercise, you get stronger. That's antifragile. Much of the book explains why the anointed create fragile systems. Only Taleb does not call them the anointed because that would be rude. He prefers the term the intellectual yet idiot. He describes them as the people who feel qualified to tell us what to do, what to eat, what to think, etc., even though their only real skill is passing exams written by people like them. One of the reasons they create fragile systems is what he calls neomania, which is once again falling in love with ideas and theories and things and technologies just because they're new. Taleb's not opposed to things that are new, but he reminds us things that have been around for a long, long time have survived for a reason. They've proven their value over time. They're anti-fragile. And if we apply that to food, which he does, which foods are going to be good for us? The foods that have been around for a long, long time. Here's a quote from the book. My rule is drink no liquid that is not at least 1,000 years old, so its fitness has been tested. I drink just wine, water, and coffee. No soft drinks. We could probably get him to try kombucha, but you see his point. Another reason they create fragile systems, they place too much value on academic theories and not enough value on practical experience. And that's because they think knowledge works like this. Ivy League researchers discover scientific principles, and then those principles are put into practical use. In other words, Harvard researchers discover and publish the laws of aerodynamics, and then birds begin to fly. But that's not the way it works in the real world. In the real world, human beings figure out what works through experience. Later, the university researchers come along and explain why it works, but we don't have to know why something works to know that it works. Or as he puts it, theories come and go, experience stays. The final reason intellectual yet idiot types create fragile systems, they want our decisions to be turned over to a central authority, and he explains why that's a bad idea. If we make our own decisions, whether as individuals, cities within a state, or states within a country, we learn from each other's successes and failures. If you try something and it works, I learn from you. If I try something and it fails, you learn from me. You learn what not to do, but you were not harmed in the process. So over time and as a group, we become smarter and stronger and more anti-fragile. But if we turn our decisions over to a central authority, the capacity to learn from each other goes away, and then one bad decision will affect everyone, which makes the system fragile. As he puts it, top-down is usually irreversible, so mistakes tend to stick, whereas bottom-up is gradual and incremental, with creation and destruction along the way. So, with all that in mind, let's take a brief look at what happened with our dietary guidelines, and if you keep Sol and Taleb in mind, I think you'll see this was entirely predictable. We had a problem. By the 1950s, too many Americans were dying of heart disease, and then along came a bold, new, exciting idea on how to fix it. Now, this idea was theoretical. It did not come from years of experience, and because it was a bad idea, it probably would have died out, except the Anointed fell in love with the idea, and we ended up with a grand plan. In the late 70s, the McGovern Commission on Nutrition decided we must convince Americans to cut back on saturated fat and cholesterol and to eat a whole lot more grains. Neomania kicked in. If foods that have been around forever are going to kill us, well then the foods that are going to save us are the ones created by modern science. As Taleb writes, chemists assumed they could produce a fat replacement that was superior to lard or butter. What Mother Nature does is rigorous until proven otherwise. What humans and science do is flawed until proven otherwise. The non-natural needs to prove its benefits, not the natural. Was there evidence that the theory behind the grand plan was a bad idea? Of course there was. As you all know, and as Dr. Price documented, there were people all over the world living on diets that were high in animal fat, but they were healthy, they had low rates of heart disease, and there were clinical studies like this, and this, and this, all showing that switching from animal fats to vegetable fats did not lower the rate of heart disease. In fact, in 2 of these studies, the rate of heart disease went up. But none of that matters once the Anointed have fallen in love with the bold, new, exciting idea. I'm going to play just the audio here from a news clip I used in Fathead. It is a doctor speaking first, followed by George McGovern.
I have pleaded in my report and will plead again orally here for more research on the problem before we make announcements to the American public.
Well, I would only argue that senators don't have the luxury that a research scientist does of waiting until every last shred of evidence is in.
We don't have time to wait for the evidence to come in. We must act now. And of course, the Anointed assumed that no good, intelligent person would possibly oppose the grand plan. And so, as Gary Taubes explained in his book, and Nina Teicholz recounted in her book, a lot of scientists found out the hard way opposing the grand plan was a great way to kill your career. The Anointed decided we had to turn the decisions about which foods are good for us over to a central authority. So they did. And we ended up with this advice. And then the central authority imposed the grand plan wherever it could. Schools, prisons, hospitals, military bases, and other government facilities were all required to follow the dietary guidelines. We've even had cases where parents who send their kids lunch from home were told they had to follow the dietary guidelines with the lunch they sent from home. A school in Chicago finally told parents, we're not even going to let you pack your kids' lunch at home because you're not following the guidelines. We are going to make sure your kids eat a healthy lunch like this. So that's how we got where we are. It follows the usual pattern. And as Dr. Phil would say, how's that working out for you? Well, you know how it's working out for us. I'm not going to go through a bunch of statistics, but I will run some headlines by you. Baby boomers are fatter and sicker than their parents were at the same age. A record number of kids now are developing fatty liver disease and type 2 diabetes. Some 10-year-olds are so overweight now they need hip replacements. And a staggering number of our troops are fat and tired, which is a far cry from how they look going into World War II. So I think we can sum up the effects of the dietary guidelines by quoting the always quotable Yogi Berra. We made the wrong mistakes, except the Anointed don't make mistakes. So the problem can't be them. It has to be us. Earlier you saw that announcement from Public Health England, the ones who explained that saturated fat will clog your kitchen sink. An official from Public Health England recently explained why Britain has an obesity problem. And here it is. It's because people aren't following well-founded government advice. Here's what that advice looks like. Got some vegetable oil to keep your sink open there. And why aren't they following the well-founded government advice? Because they're confused. In other words, the plan was good, but people didn't follow it correctly because they're stupid. In the United States, we got this explanation for why the food pyramid didn't make us all lean and healthy. The food pyramid has been described by many as difficult to understand. And as obesity rates would suggest, has gone largely unheeded by many. In other words, the plan was good, but people didn't follow it correctly because they're stupid. Apparently, people were trying to shape their meals into actual pyramids. And when that fell down, they gave up and got fat. So what we need to do, you see, is take this hugely complicated triangle and reformat the advice as a nice simple circle. And when the circle doesn't work, which it won't, we'll probably get the food square. Maybe the food parallelogram, I don't know. But to be fair to the USDA, they did not repackage exactly the same advice. Because in the 2010 guidelines, they admitted that people have gotten fatter, they admitted rates of diabetes are going up, and so we need to cut saturated fat even more. In other words, we need to do the same thing again, only bigger. So, let's move on to the good news, shall we? Ever since I made Fathead, people have been asking me on podcasts and such, what are we going to do to get the USDA to change its advice? And I always give the same answer, that's not my goal. I don't think we need national dietary guidelines any more than we need national haircutting guidelines. My goal is not to change the USDA. I don't think that's possible. My goal is to convince people to stop listening to them. Yes. And the great news is, because of what a lot of people have been doing, including many of you, that is happening. According to a recent survey, 23% of Americans still believe the USDA's dietary guidelines are actually good for them. I think that's phenomenal. Sales of full-fat dairy products are going up. Sales of butter are going way up. Sales of low-fat products are going down, and Americans are now buying more red meat for the first time in decades. In other words, the wisdom of crowds is finally striking back. So why is this happening now? Because there have always been people who knew the dietary guidelines were nonsense. Some of them are in this room and have been saying that forever. So why didn't this happen 35 years ago? Well, a little more than 35 years ago, I got my degree in journalism. One of the things we learned about was the extraordinary influence of the information gatekeepers. Information flowed from the top down through a relatively small number of gatekeepers and then down to the rest of us, and that's where it stopped. And at the time, that was true. I saw that up close and personal, because when I got out of college, I got a job as a writer for a small health magazine, and guess what? I was one of the people writing articles telling you to cut back on your saturated fat and cholesterol. I came here to apologize, of course. But I didn't know any better, because at the time, researching an article was a process that I called round up the usual suspects. Oh, you're writing an article about what causes heart disease? Well, you talk to the American Heart Association. But for background, you would read newspaper and magazine articles written by reporters who talk to the American Heart Association. And then for quotes, you would call a doctor who got his information from the American Heart Association. So I not only wrote articles promoting this advice, telling people to cut back on the bacon and eggs and eat those healthy foods like margarine and skim milk and heart-healthy cereal, I followed that advice. And in retrospect, I wish the negative effects had just kicked me in the ass really hard all at once, because then I might have figured it out. But that didn't happen. What happened was, I got a little fatter and a little sicker each year. I ended up developing asthma, I started getting arthritis, then digestive problems, I was getting a lot of sinus infections, I got a big patch of psoriasis on the back of my head, and at the time I told myself, this is what happens when you get older. I was in my 30s. People in their 30s are like puppies to me now. I mean, they're cute, but you don't want them on the good rug. You know? The point is, a lot of people were following this advice and getting the same negative results, but we didn't know that because the information flowed like this. Well, nowadays, when people are frustrated with diet and health advice that doesn't work, they do what any intelligent person would do, go out on the internet and complain to several thousand perfect strangers. And that's good, because the wisdom of crowds is based on experience. And when people go online, they are seeing countless experiences like these, which I clipped from my blog. It makes me so upset when I think of how I used to feed my daughter on the advice of her pediatrician and the government. Skim milk, cereal, pasta, bananas, orange juice. I was so frustrated because I couldn't figure out why she was so heavy. I was sent to a diabetes seminar by my doctor. I followed the diet, but my sugar was never under 170 to 180. When I went back and told the nurse, she said I didn't follow the diet correctly, which sounds like the plan was good, but people didn't follow it correctly because they're stupid. Well, nowadays, when people go online and they realize just how many people have been following this advice and getting the same kind of lousy results, they come to the logical conclusion: I'm not fat and sick because I'm stupid. I'm not fat and sick because I'm not doing it right. I'm fat and sick because this advice sucks. So then they take the next logical step, which is to go find advice that actually works for them. And because of the internet, it's happening, and surveys are showing this over and over. More and more people these days get their diet and health advice from bloggers and podcasters and filmmakers and doctors and researchers they would have never heard of before. And of course, they're getting it through organizations like the Weston A Foundation and the Nutrition Coalition. People are finding answers by watching YouTube. They are finding answers through people they follow on Twitter. Now, do these people all agree with each other? Do you all agree with each other? No. There are all these debates out there about low-carb diets, ketogenic diets, paleo diets, low-fat, high-fat, the all-meat diet, the all-potato diet, etc., etc. And you know what? That's good. Because the diet that works for you might not be the diet that works for me. And the diet that works for me when I'm 30 might not be the diet that works for me when I'm 60. Speaking of which, I had health problems in my 30s because I was getting older. Well, on Wednesday I turned 60. I don't have those health problems anymore. Thank you. And I don't have those health problems because I went out into that big, messy, unregulated crowd. I got ideas, I did some experimenting, and I found something that works for me. But if the information still flowed like this, I'm not sure I would have found those answers. I know I never would have heard of the Weston A Foundation. And that's what's great about how the internet has reignited the wisdom of crowds, because the information flows like this now. And that's how it should be. Because if you are dealing with a problem, it is better to get 100 answers from 100 different people than to get one answer from some supposed expert who happens to be wrong. Which is why it drives me nuts when I see stuff like this. The 2010 Dietary Guidelines for Americans will help policymakers, educators, clinicians, and others speak with one voice on nutrition and health. Really? We need one voice? So that one bad decision can affect everyone? No. We need thousands of voices, and the correct answers, the solutions, the one that actually work, will rise to the top. And that's why organizations like this one are so important. It's why you guys are important as individuals, and I suspect we have bloggers and podcasters in the audience. But you know what? Even if you're not a blogger or a podcaster, you are contributing to the wisdom of crowds if all you do is go online and share your experiences with the traditional diet. That does make a difference, which is why it makes me happy when I get emails like this. I wanted you to know I've lost nearly 80 pounds since Fathead made me rethink everything I'd ever learned about food and nutrition. This was a woman who was following a low-fat vegetarian diet, the kind of diet Walter Willett at Harvard thinks everyone should be on, and it wasn't working for her. So now she's on a diet of meats and eggs and other foods full of saturated fats that are going to kill her someday. And clog her kitchen sink in the meantime. And she looks like that. When people see experiences like this, it inspires them. Do some experimenting, keep looking, find what works for them. And here's the fun part for me. The information doesn't just move like this now. It's also starting to move like this. Yes, the Anointed are hearing back from the rest of us. Turns out they don't like it very much because we're not respecting the experts anymore. And I know they're paying attention because some years ago I wrote a blog post about this moronic study that claimed to find eggs are linked to diabetes. I asked, among other things, if eggs are causing diabetes, explain why diabetes was shooting up when egg consumption was going down. The researcher who produced that study actually felt compelled to show up on my blog and reply. His reply boiled down to, "You have no right to question me because I'm a PhD and you're not." Yeah, but I have the right to make fun of you because I'm a comedian and you're not. So. You want to start waving credentials around, buddy. And I, of course, don't have anything against PhDs. There are PhDs out there doing awesome research. We have heard from a bunch of them this week. And I have evidence that at least some of them begin life as normal people. So there's hope for your children. But I'm pretty sure this PhD would agree that sitting in a classroom is not the only way to learn something useful, to have knowledge that's useful. And if it is, let's throw away everything ever invented by this guy, and these guys. Here's another example of people talking back to the Anointed now. A certified diabetes instructor wrote this article explaining that diabetics should be on a low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet. Why? Because the USDA says so. The site that published that article got slammed with comments like these. This is absurd and borderline dangerous, etc., etc. Now, a bunch of people told me they tried to leave comments, which never showed up. The website explained that they were having technical difficulties. I'm thinking, as in technically, we didn't expect our expert to get slammed like this. But this happens all the time now, like last year when the American Heart Association came out with their Presidential Advisory Study, where they carefully examined the evidence and concluded, well, wouldn't you know it, we've been right all along. Saturated fat will kill you. Within 2 days, this thing was getting absolutely shredded all over the internet. And again, that happens all the time now. But the Anointed have figured out how to deal with all this back talk. It looks like this. Yes, they would like us to shut up. Dietitians in New Jersey are trying to make it illegal to give dietary advice without a state-issued license. Do you guys remember Steve Cooksey? He's a blogger. He's also a diabetic. He got his diabetes under control by returning to this. Dietitians tried to shut him down because he was giving dietary advice and he didn't have credentials. Some of you may have heard of Dr. Gary Fettke in Australia. He's a surgeon. He became appalled at the number of amputations he was performing on diabetics, so he did some research. He started advocating for a high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet. So the dietitians complained, and the agency that regulates doctors told him he could not give dietary advice anymore because he wasn't qualified. Now, he finally, just recently, got that decision reversed. And I'm sure you've heard of what happened to Dr. Tim Noakes in South Africa. A woman on Twitter asked him a question about feeding her toddler. He answered, and because he recommends a high-fat diet, dietitians complained, and the agency that regulates doctors brought him up on charges, which turned into a very long, expensive, grueling trial, which finally ended something like this. So, of course, being the Anointed, they said, hey, we should do the same thing again, only bigger. So they filed an appeal and made him go through a second trial, which ended something like this. But of course, this was never about Tim Noakes. This was about the Anointed trying to silence and intimidate pretty much everyone who disagrees with them. They think they're going to take us back to the days when they hand down the advice and we just follow it. That is not going to happen. Because if I switch to a diet that looks like this, and I lose weight, I feel great. My health improves. For the first time in my adult life, that is my experience now. And I'm not going to change my mind because the Anointed tell me to. I'm not going to go back to a diet that doesn't work because the American Heart Association puts out some other, one more bogus study. The wisdom of crowds is going to keep getting stronger and stronger because we are not going to stop sharing our experiences with each other, and we're not going to shut up. And I'll give you just one more example of why I won't shut up. This was a woman who posted in the Fathead Facebook group. She'd been trying the low-fat diet her entire life. She was constantly miserable. She never really lost any weight until, as she writes, I started searching online for ideas. At that point, a perfect storm of coincidences happened. We were led to the oiling of America, which led to tons of documentaries on health and nutrition, which led to Fathead. My searches had already started me to watch my carbs, but Fathead put it all in place, that light bulb moment. In the past year, I have now lost almost 65 pounds. This Thanksgiving, I'm grateful for all the people, scientists, doctors, bloggers, everyday people who never gave up on getting the message out to people like me who were utterly despondent and desperate. If it weren't for this information, I would be a fat, unhealthy, unhappy mess. There are millions of people like her out there. Isn't that why we all do what we do? I think it is. And so to sum up, I'm going to explain why the wisdom of crowds won't go away by telling an old joke. A couple of drunks are sitting in a bar watching TV, and the 6 o'clock news shows a guy standing on the ledge of a building. So the first drunk elbows the second, and he says, "Bet you $20 he jumps." Second drunk says, "All right, I got $20, says he doesn't." Well, sure enough, the guy jumps. Second drunk says, "I'm an honest man, here's your 20. First drunk says, "Nah, I can't take your money. I've been drinking here all day. I seen him jump on the 4 o'clock news. I seen him jump on the 5 o'clock news." And the second drunk says, "So did I, but I didn't think he'd do it again." The reason people are turning back to the wisdom of crowds is that for 40 years they have been told to make the same bad bet with their diets over and over and over, and they're tired of losing, and they are not going to do it again. Thank you very much. It's been an honor.